College football nerds here in championship week, talking Clemson and Notre Dame for the ACC championship, which is a little weird since we're talking about Notre Dame and the ACC championship. Obviously, I got Josh with me. We're going to model this game, and we're going to show and talk about the original model and how it performed and how it saw these teams, and the model now and how it sees these teams. But first, before we get into the super nerdy stuff, I want to remind y'all, please like, please subscribe. I know we haven't got to cover either one of these teams as much as we wanted to this year. Some of it's time related. Some of it is just because they were so much better than the rest of the field. But we're talking about them now. We're going to be talking about them in the playoffs. Spoiler alert, I think that even if Notre Dame loses this game, which I don't know that we're picking that, we still think they're in the playoffs. So there's still a lot on the line for both of these teams, and this game's got to happen first. So, Josh, I want to start with talking about sort of the tenor of college football and how they view these two teams since Notre Dame won. I feel like the talking heads in general, and we're part of that, has sort of dismissed the win over Clemson by Notre Dame early in the season as a marginalized thing that happened as a fluke, and they don't have the credit that they should get. And I've got Notre Dame in number 2 in my poll, and it reflects that. But I still think in the back of our mind, we're not saying, okay, this is a team that beat Clemson. We're saying this is a team that beat Clemson with an asterisk. And I want to kind of dispel that and get rid of all that. Like, Notre Dame might lose this game. It's an elite team they're playing. They could lose. But before that game happens, and after that game happens, we need to remember on their resume that they did go toe-to-toe with a Clemson team that got a great performance from their quarterback. So am I crazy here? Like, should we be discounting this? And I know you probably agree with me, but talk about that a little bit.
Clemson may not have had Trevor Lawrence in that game, but Clemson did have DJ Uiagalelei, and DJ did put on a great performance. He was 29 of 44, 66% passing, 439 yards and 44 attempts. It's 10 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns. His quarterback rating of 164 is actually above Clemson's season average. It's better than Lawrence had any of the last 2 games. He was over a yard per play better than Lawrence has been the past 2 games. Over 2 yards per play better than Lawrence had been in the 2 games prior to the Notre Dame game. I think Clemson has an exceptional backup quarterback. And it's a lot like, I don't know if this is on par with, but it may well be like Alabama with Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa. They've got 2 guys that are both capable of winning a title. And I think Uiagalelei is, all things put together, a quarterback that's capable of winning a title as a freshman. He is that good. I'm not sure in the college game where the line really is between the two. Lawrence is usually really good, but he definitely has off games. And he's going to be a tremendous NFL quarterback because of his arm talent, his ability to throw the ball vertically. But the college game is a little weird. It's a little bit more about just efficiency because guys tend to be open. So the biggest thing you can do as a quarterback is just get the ball to someone every play. Your ability to buy time with escapability and your ability to just distribute the ball quickly is important with that, as well as accuracy. Uiagalelei is elite in all those categories. And it's hard to say this without it being taken as a slight against Lawrence, which it's not. I'm not sure how much better Lawrence really is than Uiagalelei. So I think that's the first point. And when you talk about Lawrence being back, I think that's the wrong asterisk. Absolutely the wrong asterisk. Clemson still put up 40 points in that game, and I don't feel like the passing game held them back in any way. And maybe you can make the argument that it cost them the game in overtime, but it's all like the Florida situation with the field goal and throwing the shoe, right? Everybody focuses on throwing the shoe with Marco Wilson, and yeah, it kind of cost them the game. Nobody talks about the goal line stand that LSU had at the beginning of the game. And if Florida kicks a field goal there, they don't need the field goal at the end of regulation. If Florida punches it in there, they don't, field goal doesn't win it for LSU at the end of the game. So that stuff all comes together, and people remember how it ends, but all the points count equally. I I think the issue for Clemson was totally defensive injuries. Skowski in particular is a huge loss for them. And when you combine like Tyler Davis on the D line and Skowski and then Jones, you mean like all the way up the middle, and they had guys dropping throughout the game too. Just junior, backed up all across the board, and it let Notre Dame be extremely efficient. The reason Notre Dame won that game is they scored 47 points. So if you talk about all the offensive stuff, if you want to talk about what happened in that game, is that Clemson gave up a lot of yards and a lot of points to a Notre Dame team that has not necessarily been score happy week after week. They've been really efficient. They've had some games where, quite frankly, Ian Book really impressed me. The Boston College game, which was kind of a drawn out game, uber efficient. And he never let Boston College really start to threaten them or feel like they were going to win the game, I should say, because he was so efficient the entire game. I still don't think you expect Notre Dame to score 40 on Clemson in their defense. And I think that's the story of this game. That's why the lines moved. That's why the opinions moved. The public may be all about the Lawrence stuff, but from Vegas and from my perspective, the story of this game is absolutely about Clemson's defense and the defensive injuries that allowed Notre Dame to score enough to keep up in the original one.
And we were talking about this before we hit record. There is this perception, I think, that they're back, but they still are missing guys. And not only that, you made a great point, and I'm going to take all your talking points and just steal them and make them mine. We know Georgia was depleted against Florida and have kind of forgotten about them since because they've won some games and don't realize that Georgia team, while they've had some guys come back, they're not 100%. So they're playing out of necessity. Because either the guy at 70% that's the starter is still better than the backup, or the backup's hurt, which is the case in Clemson's case. So, and we're going to get into Clemson and the things that we love about them, but how big of a concern is it for you that a lot of these guys that they needed to get the win against Notre Dame the first time around either aren't back or aren't 100%?
It's a concern the same as it was last time, I think. The problem Clemson ran into with Notre Dame is they're extremely physical. Notre Dame is a very efficient team. They are a very physical, consistent football team that marches the ball slowly down the field. They haven't been super vertical. Now, people forget Notre Dame was missing receivers at that point in the season, which I think it's kind of funny because if you want to talk short-term offensive injuries, I think Notre Dame was in a much worse spot than Clemson was, and they've improved a lot because they actually have some deep threats on the roster now. But by and large, they still are, like last couple games, they've been about 8 yards per attempt, 7.7 yards per attempt against Syracuse. Workman-like is the wrong term, really, but they grind out their 40 points. That's hard on a defensive roster, and it's hard on depth. So I think the problem for Clemson is going to be when these guys that have come back from injury get banged around and one goes out, how are they able to replace them? Now, they got a platoon of guys defensively. That defensive side of the ball, they've lost Venables. We're talking about like the backup is broke his arm, so he's not going to play. But they've got a whole bunch of other guys like Bentley at linebacker, which shout out is dox myself slightly, but his brother's a longtime friend of mine. Really good players on the defensive side of the ball. Lots of depth. They've got a platoon of guys that can fill in. I think the problem, though, it's like we're talking about with Alabama in the Alabama-Florida preview. Alabama has a lot of guys that don't get hurt by depth, but they don't necessarily have that many that are the guy. And the problem that Clemson's going to get to is they have a couple guys that are the guy. I think Skowski's really, really good, and he's especially a heady player. But if he's out, you've got a lot of guys that are going to be able to fill gaps and play, but none of them are necessarily impactful. And I think we've already seen that kind of with LSU situation. Like when Stingley's not in the game, they've got a lot of corners that are okay. And they held their own against Florida enough to get a win, but they certainly aren't good. And the thing that helped them with Florida is they've got like 7 of those guys. And so they could go in dime packages against Florida and hold the run in the passing game. But they still gave up plays, and Florida kept staying in the game, looked like they were going to win it, because those corners just aren't necessarily great. And so you can play swarm defense and be really effective and generate turnovers and all the stuff that LSU did in the game, but it's hard to really lock somebody down in that way. And Clemson has been a lockdown defense for the past few years. And they're really, really good, but the standard that Clemson's at, a lot like where Alabama's at defensively or a lot of other programs, it's a little jarring to see a defense that isn't necessarily locked down.
On the flip side, and I want to talk about this in Clemson's favor, something you talked about with Skowski that I think is sort of hidden, not in statistics and not concrete and tangible enough that we can put our fingers on it. But Trevor Lawrence brings something. Your starting quarterback in any situation brings something beyond skill to the game. And in this case, in two ways. One, just knowing the offense, being a calming presence, being a guy that can go out and get you a touchdown when the game's on the line, that kind of thing that Trevor Lawrence is going to bring to the table as a multi-year starter that DJ didn't have. Even though he put up a good performance, there's some hidden maturity and responsibility there that the backup's just not going to have. And two, from a scheme standpoint, and again, I know Clemson scored a lot of points the first time around, but from a scheme standpoint, Clemson was limited with their offensive playbook where they won't be limited now against Notre Dame. How much of that do you think comes into play in this game where, yes, as you said, Clemson got a great performance from their backup quarterback, but a lot of these soft skill type of things that don't show up in the box score could potentially be the difference in this game?
I think that's certainly the case. I think the average fan doesn't necessarily see some things that happen when a backup quarterback's in terms of guys not running the right way or slide protections and that sort of stuff. And even, I don't know if I do or do not qualify as an average fan, but people like me can't look at it and know what they're not running. I mean, unless you have an inside-out understanding of the offense and break it down on a play-by-play film level, what you often don't see is, they're running 30% of their playbook. Especially with a true freshman, people always wonder, like, why didn't Tua start over Jalen? That's the Alabama example. Or why didn't Trevor Lawrence start over Kelly Bryant originally? Because game one, they don't know the whole playbook yet. They can get it by about halfway through the season, and you can build enough for them to run an offense and have enough counters in there that things run effectively. But when you've got your starter in the game or a guy that's a multi-year guy in the system, he not only knows the base play, he knows 6 protections, he knows 2 audibles out of the play, and he knows 4 or 5 counter variations of the play where now we're going to roll play action, we're going to run a reverse out of it, we're going to run a screen out of it, we're going to run a quarterback sneak out of it, and all that stuff allows you offensively to do things better because the defense doesn't see it coming. And you see however the player runs. You see a player struggle or succeed on a given play based off the play call that was made, but you don't necessarily see all the other plays that set it up or the fact that this play was a breaking tendency in some way or something the other team hasn't seen. You can do that with a starter. And what we talk about a lot is the first time a freshman plays, they usually look really good that first game. The second time or the third time they play, you start to see really diminishing returns. And it's because usually there's a set amount of plays they can run. As a starter, it's hard to watch film on a starter and go into a game against an elite team and use the film that effectively because they're going to do things you haven't seen before that they've prepped for that team. And I think that is an advantage for Clemson in this game, is that they're going to come in and they're going to have a portion of their playbook because they've dominated people by and large throughout the season. They haven't had a show. And Lawrence is going to know how to run that in a way that DJ didn't, because you were hoping to get DJ at a level where he could run the base offense. Lawrence, you're going to be able to really throw stuff at Notre Dame and break tendency. And when Notre Dame schemes things based off what Lawrence does, you're going to have a counter for it. The other thing I will say about Lawrence is he's a better runner. I think DJ to me is a Big Ben like archetype. He's athletic. He's not particularly fast. He's a big tight end kind of build. He's going to be a monster because of his size, but he's not going to run away from guys. Lawrence is a step or two faster. Lawrence can, on the zone read stuff, schematically creates a lot of problems for defenses. And we see him like hit 40 plus yards against Virginia Tech. His rush numbers may not be great because college counts in sacks, but he gets a lot of run yards. I think the biggest thing, though, isn't just the run yards he gets, but how much teams have to respect the fact that he can possibly run. And when he does run, it's often in critical down and distance, short yardage, or a lot of times in the goal line, they like to run those bootlegs and just run Lawrence in. That is a real issue for teams playing Lawrence. And I think that's actually a major factor. And it may not show up in a yardage sense, like in our per yard per play, yard per carry stuff. We're very aware of the fact it's not the be all end all. I think that's something Lawrence brings to the table on those short plays, that extra yard or two in key situations. Schematically, with his understanding of the offense and his ability to run the ball, both designed and non-designed plays, it gets you a couple yards that can get you a first down or turn a field goal into a touchdown, and that's the stuff that wins ball games.
Okay, so why don't you get us into the model and we'll talk off of that. Basically, like I said in the open, I'd love for you to talk through the original model and how it saw the teams and sort of what the new model for this game is showing.
So the original model, it did have Clemson winning the game 36-27. The game ended up higher scoring than that, but important caveat, the game went into overtime. So as we say, the model is never going to predict an overtime game. It sometimes actually will predict a tie. I don't think it was particularly far off. Overtime, going into overtime, the score was 33-33. We have 27-36. So the model was right around the right score, and it really was the sort of coin flip. Do they score? Don't they score? Right at the end there, that made that game what it is. And we're never going to be able to predict that. And that's, no model is ever going to predict it. There's no way to do that. That is a true random chance thing. That's the game of football. That's why it's fun to watch. But that 27-36 game was like 5.5 yards per play predicted from both teams. We noted same yardage, but Clemson's a little bit more efficient. Clemson looked like they were going to win it. It fell off. Whatever. Pretty accurate. I think the interesting thing in the new model is the shift is really on the Clemson side of the ball. Clemson has become a better offense since then. And Notre Dame, I think just a little bit, kind of holding their own. So when you put the two together, the Notre Dame score is about the same. It's 28 points, where you predicted 27 in the original. The Clemson score went from 36 to 41. And in a nutshell, it really boils down to the fact that Clemson is passing quite a bit better. They're 8.6 yards per attempt, whereas they were 8 going into the last Notre Dame game. A lot more effective passing the ball. And then they've been a lot more efficient scoring off their yardage the past few weeks. So sort of the combination of that, in our model's opinion, is that this game stretched out about 5 points further. And then when you look at the margin, and I've looked at the betting line again, we don't really look at it when we're figuring out scores, but it's about 10 points. I think that's why it is kind of where it is. They're seeing the same thing. Clemson is playing a little bit better ball. They're a little bit better defensively. They're a little bit better offensively. Maybe a field goal better on both sides of the ball, honestly. But a field goal better on both sides of the ball is about a touchdown. So whereas this was a 9-point game in our model last time, now it's a 13-point game. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think it's interesting that it's expected to be higher scoring, but I also think it's interesting that the past few weeks Clemson has really kind of closed the gap and put it off. And I'll note, my model does not take recency into account. So it's not saying that Clemson is peaking. It's just saying their performance late in the season has been good enough to bring their average performance up to where they should expect to score in the 40s rather than the 30s, which is where they did score against Notre Dame the first time.
It's interesting, and I'm going to give my score now. I opened this show with the point that Notre Dame hasn't gotten enough credit for their win against Clemson earlier in the year. And I think what's also missed about that first game, and I'm picking Notre Dame to win this game, and I'm going against maybe the feel of the season and the feel of that game, because we remember. This is going to be a weird analogy. Y'all hang on with me for just a minute. We talk about, or we see kind of, it's commonly accepted that that Alabama gets a lot of breaks from the refs. I told you it's going to be weird. You and I are really harp on the fact that they actually don't. It's the opposite. And that we showed some numbers that show Alabama, not only do their opponents score, or their opponents are like 120th, 130th every year for penalties against their opponents, they also never, ever get called for holding. Ever. Their opponents never get called for holding. We remember the one flag that Alabama got away with murder. And it happens. Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, teams that have been good lately, they will get away with murder. And Clemson fans, y'all have heard enough of this from Ohio State fans for the last year. I know you have. You're sick of it. They remember that one play where Alabama got away with murder and forget the 7 previous plays where their guy got tackled in the backfield and the holding flag wasn't thrown. We remember that Trevor Lawrence didn't play in this game. We remember that Notre Dame had to score with 20 seconds left to put it into overtime. We forget, and this is why I'm picking Notre Dame, we forget that Notre Dame had a lot of very uncharacteristic, self-inflicted wounds that left at least 14, probably 17 to 20 points on the board. With it being turnovers or the fact that they've got 2 times in the red zone, a wide open tight end. Ian Book read it right, made the play. The guy just drops it. And it's those are the kinds of things that don't happen. Like if it happened all the time, sure, but they didn't. They happened all in this game, which artificially made the game closer than it was. I think DJ played a great game. I think a lot of these defensive players are still out, still banged up. And I think Notre Dame is not getting credit for being the team that was good enough to beat an elite Clemson team, because I think Clemson's an elite team. And I think they're sick of hearing it. So I've got Notre Dame 34, Clemson 31, and now, Josh, you get to tell me why I'm crazy.
I don't think it's crazy at all. I mean, the thing that I'd note is, like, from the penalty perspective, why is it the way it is, and why do you have that whole deal with the penalties? It's that when you're in a big game, refs let things go. And when you're a top team, they let things go a lot. Notre Dame's case, 2017, they were in the 50s in opponent penalties, about dead average. 2018, they make the playoffs. Where do they end up in opponent penalties? 116th. 116th in the country. Only 14 teams had more opponent penalties than they did. And it's because they became an elite team. And when you're an elite team, every game's a big game. And in big games, they don't throw many flags. The reality of that, I think, is it really benefits the offenses in these games because there usually aren't many holding calls. ACC refs are a little weird, but there aren't many holding calls. Things go. Title up in a bow, I think that benefits the team with the better deep threat quarterback, and that is Trevor Lawrence. Notre Dame has shown the ability to stretch the field vertically, particularly in the past few weeks now that they've gotten some of their receiving targets back. But I do think Lawrence is a uniquely talented deep passer. I don't love where Clemson is at in terms of receivers. I do think Rodgers and Powell are a good tandem. I think Galloway is a grossly underrated player in his ability to stretch the field vertically. But even though these guys, they're very good, they're just not Ross or Higgins or that sort of NFL number 1 deep threat level that those guys are. They're more underneath guys that they can use vertically. I still think Lawrence gives them the ability to hit the quick strike. And to me, that makes this a higher scoring game. And I think rather than hitting 33, I think Clemson's about a touchdown better. So I would say 41-31. Notre Dame, just like the model says, is about the same offensively as they were last time. But I think Clemson gets about an extra touchdown. And all it takes in a game that went to overtime is one extra TD. And that's enough for Clemson to win this game, by about 10 points, which is the spread.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on this one. Ran a little long, but that's all right. Y'all like listening to us talk nerdy about what y'all got going on. Clemson fans, Notre Dame fans, you know what to do. Let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to turn out to be. And let us know what your score prediction means for these two teams' playoff shakeout and how everything goes. If Notre Dame wins this game, we got some real weirdness at number 4. So talk about it. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.